Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome everyone. I am very pleased to be able to introduce somebody I've known all my life. Abdal Latif Whiteman, aka Ian Whiteman, author of this book, Average White Man, ho ho ho, nice little pun in the title there, who happens to also be my dad. So welcome, Abdal Latif.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Welcome. I'm in an empty room, so it's a bit strange.
So this book came out, you wrote it during the pandemic, didn't you, during the lockdown?
Well, not really. It was finalized in we printed it just at the end of the lockdown, but actually it's been tampered, it's all written and tampered over about 15 or 16 years.
Interesting. But it was only came out a couple of days ago.
When I came to Spain 20 years ago, I was kind of shocked, and I suddenly sort of sat down and I thought, where was I? Where have I been? And so it's like a kind of retrospective journal of where I had been to just sort out in my own brain what happened. I had just literally had to ask people, when was it I did this? When was it? Because it was all a kind of blur. So it's actually not, it was finished in the COVID thing. Everyone was writing bios in COVID, as far as I know. Roger Waters from the Pink Floyd wrote one as well. He discovered how much he liked writing, actually. I saw an interview with him. Maybe it's just people had to sit down and think about little things. But for me, it was just it came to a kind of climax, to put it like that.
Okay, let me read a quick bio for everybody who has not come across you before. Ian Abdal Latif Whiteman is a designer and musician who resides in Andalusia, Spain, where he lives with his American wife. He has 4 children and 8 grandchildren. In the 1960s, he studied architecture in London, where he also worked as a musician, performing and recording with many notable artists, and we will ask you about some of those later. A founding member of the groups Mighty Baby and the Habibiyya, he discovered Islam in 1971. His career since then has been in book and typographic design, working closely with pioneering institutions like Zaytuna College and Cambridge Muslim College. He is a specialist in Andalusian classical singing and calligraphy. So as we can tell from this bio, already you have a number of feathers in your hat, and writing is now one of them. But I wanted to ask you, first of all, could you talk a little bit about your creative background? What got you into the arts in a more general sense?
Golly, no one's ever asked me that before. I think when you're a child, you play, and a lot of people have said that playing is very instrumental in developing skills later on, and just creative skills later on. Because when you're playing, you're just inventing, making a mess. And I can remember a lot of my life I was playing when I was young, and that in a way, and then it developed into drawing and music. Music was a thread from the very beginning, all the way through my life, in fact. And I mean, there wasn't that much music around. This is like the 1940s. I was born just after the Second World War, and we had a wind-up gramophone and a radio. That was it. Otherwise, you played the music yourself on a piano. Every house had a piano in it. So when you're a child and there's a piano, you sort of mess around on it. I went for piano lessons for a time with a woman called Ethel M. Free in Fuller's Avenue, Woodford, E18. I must have got 6. And I spent for several lessons until one day we went there and the room was half filled with water up to my knees, and the end of piano lessons. So I started to do it myself. And I wrote a piece of music when I was about 6 years old. I even scored it. I can't even remember how it goes. It's terrible. I won't sing it to you. But it carried on inventing, improvising, but at the same time drawing a lot. I used to cover acres and acres of paper with drawings. Go on from there. It's the typical life of a small boy and a teenager with every kind of craze you can imagine.
It's interesting that music should have been the thread, and in a way also I happen to know, as well as it is also described in your memoir, how music actually brought you to Islam in a sense. Would you like to just run through that with us a little bit?
Well, you have to read the book to get the whole story, because it's quite a long thread, if it's a thread indeed. I wasn't really a seeker. You know, people say, well, I'm a seeker. And actually, this is not a conversion story. I have to emphasize it's a biography, because when Islam comes along, much later, it's the 1971. So in 1945, I was born. 1971 was when things started to happen on the spiritual front, if you want to call it that. I was just a kind of benign hedonist playing in a rock group and looking for kind of musical highs, if you like. And it was very inventive. And we were with, you know, London in the 1960s, what people imagine what it's like rather than what it was. It was a difficult time in many ways. Lots of things were kind of collapsing and other things happening. Eggs were breaking, but things were hatching at the same time. It was the story of the music is actually quite critical to the story, because I having played with various small groups when I went to London, I could go back even further actually. I really wanted to go to be a jazz pianist. My parents, my father and my brother said, oh no, you're good at physics and art, become an architect. So the only way I could get to London was to study architecture. But I got to London and it was very disappointing for me, because the jazz scene wasn't what I thought it would be. I'd listened to all this wonderful music of from America, what I call the golden age of jazz, which was from about 1958 to 62, coming mostly out of New York. But when I was at school, which was a very musical school, we were singing, there was hymn singing, there was choral singing, there was orchestras, there was jazz groups, everything you can imagine. But when I was about 16, everyone had a club in the school. This was a co-educational Quaker school, by the way. There was clubs for everything. There was a young farmers club, there was a radio club, there was a railway club, and there was a jazz club. And you have to imagine 4 or 5 boys in sort of blazers and sitting around on chairs, listening to mono vinyl records, which someone had brought from London. I can remember his name, of American imports. And this music was incredible. I can't see myself on the screen. Does that mean I'm still there? Oh,
yeah, you're there. It's just, Ambata, would you mind muting yourself?
Okay.
Sorry.
And what happened was, although we were surrounded by all this classical, you know, the typical music, we were from Handel to Verdi to Bach and everything, it was an amazing experience, but it was the music of history. Suddenly we hear this music coming from America, and it was the future. It was this incredible, the impact on us was absolutely monumental. It was Miles Davis, Coltrane, Thelonious Monk, Art Blakey, Bill Evans. It went on and on and on. But every year, the clubs were allowed to have an expedition. You have a journey somewhere, and we went to see. This is absolutely true. It was in 1961 in the Golden State Kilburn. It was the John Coltrane Quartet with Eric Dolphy and supported by the Dizzy Gillespie Big Band, which is like, when I think about it now, it was like quite extraordinary to just suddenly see Coltrane playing my favorite things for half an hour on stage. And the impact was enormous. I didn't really quite understand it, actually. You just saw this light reflecting off his face and this and it was, his music was then getting quite spiritual in many ways. But anyway, I ended up in London. To cut a long story short, I ended up playing this group called Mighty Baby, having gone through various things in between. And actually, what was interesting, actually, I could even read a bit. There's a critical part of the story where me, the benign hedonist, is suddenly confronted with things of a spiritual nature. It's a short chapter. In fact, the whole book is filled with short chapters for pretty good reason, actually. It's much easier to navigate. It's called Strange Things in Switzerland. The band spent the next few months busy writing and rehearsing material for the new upcoming album for Blue Horizon, which is a record company. And we would meet at times between engagements at an apartment in Harley Road near Swiss Cottage in London, in which these rehearsals would take place. We had been very affected by the American new wave country sound sometime after the Watershed gig we had with the Byrds, who were a really enormous, famous American band when they came to England, and their small Fender amps and their tight light sound Seeing Bob Dylan and the band at the Isle of Wight, where we had been playing, had opened the doors to a quieter, more dynamic sound, typified somehow by the fact that the band's drummer and singer, Levon Helm, sat out in front of the band instead of the back, surrounded by the other musicians. It was just a more intelligent, musical and artistic way to go rather than The Who's extreme volume art school type of angry music when they smashed everything up. I saw that several times. Our songwriting was okay and interesting, but it all seemed to lag a bit, and gigs were notable for long sessions of guitar tuning, which was very frustrating for all. Shortly before these rehearsals started, we set off for a tour of Switzerland and Germany, which was the first time we'd actually been abroad as Mighty Baby. After a lot of motorway driving and a lot of Spiegelei and pommes frites, we arrived and played a 3-night residency in Munich, in what was apparently an old Gestapo bunker deep underground. It didn't feel menacing or evil as we imagined it might be, but I noticed that we were expected to follow a very orderly discipline every night, and starting and finishing at precise times and marching around in an orderly way with the promoter. One afternoon, Roger, the drummer, and I sampled the local Munich beer out of interest, which was very strong and frothy, and a small amount left us laughing helplessly. So this is why the Bavarians are so jolly. Remember, this is like 1970. In the hotel where we were staying, I popped into the guitarist's room, Martin. He's a kind of key figure in the story, actually. I should really say that when he actually joined the band, he replaced someone who had left, and he came with a guitar in one hand and the copy of the Bhagavad Gita in the other, which was an indication of where it was all going to go. Anyway, I popped into Martin's room in the hotel, only to find him head on the floor, looking, as I thought, under his bed. Martin, I said, and repeated. And when I got no answer, I left slightly confused, but thought no more of it. We went for a day trip to Zugspitze, a dramatic Bavarian mountain at the beginning of the Alps. It was cloudy, but the cable car took us up through the clouds to the top, where if you wanted, you could walk, I did, into Austria and back, no questions asked. This is before the EU. The air was cold and clear at that altitude, and the volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, which for some reason I had in my pocket, read very clearly in that lessened air pressure. Switzerland was very clean and neat, and in Basel it was gratifying to get paid cash in hand for the gig and go out and buy a Swiss watch with a black face and curiously some geometrical instruments. Don't know why. Zurich was a strange place, the great financial centre of Switzerland, where the shop windows, as I recall, were filled with money for people to look at. Or did I imagine that? On the return trip out of Switzerland, we happened to pass by the factory of Sandel's laboratories, where LSD had been discovered, in front of which was a whole field of some strange plant growing in abundance. Some of the band thought it must be some experimental hallucinogenic and picked it and smoked it with no effect. I used to do the same when I was young with woodbines, a kind of plant that grew in Essex, thinking that this was something to do with woodbine cigarettes, which was this cheap brand of cigarettes you could buy at the time. Humans do the oddest of things sometimes. Driving along the Autobahn on the return journey, I was ensconced in the back seat of the white Ford Transit, just looking out of the window, when the driver braked rather violently. 2 of Martin's large books landed on my head. I noticed that they were a 2-volume set translation of the Quran by Yusuf Ali, whoever he was. Big and heavy. Again, I thought no more of it, and we drove on safety back to London. What none of us knew then was that Martin had secretly joined a dervish order in Morocco and not told us. So it was.
It was actually part of your music career was what ended up taking you in this
I didn't get it.
way.
These things happened. You must realize in 1970. If you'd said the word mosque, most people wouldn't have known what you were talking about. If you'd said Islam, what's that? If you'd said Muslim, if you said Muslim to me, I felt there's a kind of fabric, Muslim. And there's probably maybe a couple of mosques in England, for all we know. So you have to imagine a time where it was not on the landscape, on the radar anyway at all. And why things started to happen at that point. But Martin his name was Abdul Malik, actually. You have to read the story to get the whole picture. It's quite complicated.
Okay, well, I think that gives a little bit of a taste. And since you've done this little reading, it's interesting that when you read, we've been talking lately on our membership platform about voice and developing voice and all the things that come with writing about your own story, if you're writing a memoir particularly. And I wanted to ask you, did you have any thoughts about how you would approach developing your voice, or did you kind of write a stream of consciousness and then try and puzzle it together in a logical order? Or, was there any kind of process in developing a voice that felt authentic?
I think it was a flow of consciousness, because when I went back to look at some of the stuff I first wrote, it really made me cringe, and I had to sort of like cut a lot of it out. It's very much how I would speak. I think I would write if I speak, but I prefer to write than to speak, actually, because I can't edit what I speak because it's gone. Unless, of course, you record it and then fiddle around with it. But I think that, I come from a family of very literary family. The father was a journalist, an editor, and my brother was a journalist and an editor. My uncle was a journalist. My grandfather was a journalist. Blah blah blah.
A novelist.
I wasn't. Yeah, both sides. The two grandfathers were were writers, and I wasn't. I think I was a disappointment to my history teacher. But the thing I did understand was music, and art to a point. I understand. I like drawing. I like music, because I understood the music, but I did read. You're expected to read E.M. Forster, and I loved Shakespeare when we had to study it 12th night. But it gives you a kind of a idea about words. I think that I was actually very influenced by, in later life, actually, I heavily into things like P.G. Wodehouse, Raymond Chandler, Ross MacDonald, and they have a particular style. And I see, when I read myself, I've picked up certain ideas from them, partly to do with description. I mean, Ross MacDonald, in sort of like sleazy West Coast crime, but he would start off a chapter or start off a book with a beautiful paragraph describing a valley. It's just beautifully written. P.G. Wodehouse did exactly the same thing. He would start off this description of sunlight coming down the streets of London, and bees were buzzing, and with the sunlight would go in a window, and there was this man. It's just set the scene. But then they had a style of writing. P.G. Wodehouse said that if you're going to be a novelist, you either have to plunge deep down into the human drama, or just write comedy, and he chose comedy. My maternal grandfather, he wrote children's books, lots of them, for Herbert Jenkins, who was a publisher in, before the Second World War, before the First World War. And in fact, he lived in a village in north of London called Barnet, which is now just a suburb. But he lived in the same village as P.G. Wodehouse, and they used to play cricket together. They had the same publisher together with Herbert Jenkins. But my grandfather went on to just write schoolboys books like Death Flies High, or Airships Over the South Atlantic, absurd titles.
Daisy Gets a Farm and things like that. Yeah, I think we pulped all of those. Yeah. I seem to remember.
There's some here, you can see them all.
Oh, you kept the covers.
I found the covers.
They're very vintage, but the content was just a little bit appalling, really, wasn't it?
I had a lot of the first editions, but quite honestly, they were so racist. I mean, there was a sort of accepted degree of racism in books of that time, and I really didn't like it, so I just got rid of them. Not for not that much money either, but I even read those, but it was like, they were aimed at schoolboys. And P.G. Wodehouse started doing the same. In fact, he wrote schoolboy books. That's what sold. But when he started writing Jeeves for the Strand magazine, other novelists started writing for magazines. Who is it? Alexander McCall Smith. The 44 Scotland Street series was all written for the Scotsman, the newspaper. So he had very short chapters, which is a very nice way of reading, because and people got so addicted to them. They would write and suggest what the next chapter would be. And I got gripped by. I bought all of 44 Scotland Street. It's a wonderful series of books, and he has a style like P.G. Wodehouse does. Of there's the story and the plot and the characters who, in P.G. Wodehouse's case, are hilarious. But he always finishes a chapter, as I did with that. I realized with that one I just read, with a kind of a surprise, which makes you want to go for the next. And it's a technique, I could read it. I mean, P.G. Wodehouse is a wonderful writer. They've always said he was the great link between the Victorian masters and between writing now and writing before, when writing was very different. It's full of Shakespearean quotes, biblical quotes, poetic quotes, but in the most hilarious way. And a command of syntax, which, frankly, I would read paragraphs and I go, is that possible? I have to sort of turn it around. Can you say that in English? It's really stretched my mind. I think that affected the way I write completely. Actually, I have to admit, I'm more sort of I'm a Wodehouseian sort of. I don't have his characters, of course, but and so, as someone once said that no one can compete with Wodehouse when it comes to metaphors. His metaphors are just so wonderful, describing the absurd, the aristocracy of England, or just anything. He could say it was like a blah 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 blah. I can't quote it. But
yeah, it's interesting you bring up the comedy thing as well, because in the context of developing a voice, if a person likes to quip and make people laugh and joke around, it's gonna flow into their writing quite naturally, isn't it?
I find that much more writing than speaking. I can think much more easily with a pen. I was doing this article about the Cambridge Mosque just recently, and I started thinking about I was put dyed in the wall modernist. No, I changed it to dyed in the concrete modernist. It looked so good on the page. Dyed in the concrete. Things like that. You can play around with words, and certainly, I think people have a good command of English. You could almost invent words. And I know my brother Kay, who you knew, he loved words. He and my father were expert at Scrabble, and I was not bad, but they would almost invent English words, and you realise that actually someone who has a really comprehensive knowledge of English can do that. Abdul Hakim Murad does that. He comes on his lectures, you see on the paradigms of leadership. He comes up with words which I say, is that an English word? It's because if your knowledge of the Latin roots and everything else, you can do that. Invent words, and of course he invented imaginary places, countries he invented. It's writing is a very interesting thing. Why I think it's interesting. Roger Waters suddenly discovered writing in the lockdown, and it's actually quite eloquent. You may not agree with everything he says, but it's just a way of expression. It's pretty notable what he does. Sorry, I'm rabbiting.
No, it's good, and it's interesting because you bring up a point, and then it makes me think of something, and this is kind of how our brains work, and you can see where I get it from. In the context of reflective writing, this is what I've always felt as well, is that there's sort of different reasons for wanting to sit down and write. And one, I think, is that kind of life writing or reflective writing, which is quite therapeutic and putting into place things in order to understand them better. Because once it's on a page, you can visualize it, and you're separate from it, and it's in a way just more comprehensible somehow. And also you can write down everything that your brain kind of produces, and then you can sort of reorder it and make it more logical. And if your mind's all over the place, it gives you that opportunity to be like, oh, this is how everything flows, and it gives that sort of clarity.
I certainly think that for me the creative process is finding order out of chaos. I think the creative mind is really a kind of compost heap of rubbish, actually. and the only thing that actually brings any sense is when you're given a job to do, and you say, I need this by Wednesday, and you go blah, 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 and a thing to deliver. I think the compost idea and theory of creativity is a claim to myself. No, I don't know about compost heaps. I've got one at home. But it is actually, I think, even with music, it's creating a kind of order out of chaos, because it's such a, one's mind is such a jumble of ideas, in fact, especially in this kind of heat. But it's I've always been slightly uncertain about young people writing biographies, because I also think, well, if you're going to write something, you've got to write about something. I guess if you've got an imagination, you could just write about anything, but there's nothing better than to write about the truth. If you can remember truthfully your life. And when I was writing this book, for me, was an amazing exercise, because I can remember things when I was very, very young, incredibly young. In fact, you wanted me to read a bit of the prologue from this, because it's actually about when I was born, in fact.
Okay.
And the first 3 months, because it's
the part about the green.
It's about the green caravan.
Yes.
Yeah, this is. It's not that long, actually. It's just, it goes over the other page, but it sets the scene in a way for the whole book. It doesn't really mention music, but which is an important part. It says, this is how it goes. I'll try and read it really slowly. The caravan was old and green, with one rear window, dark green, the kind with two wheels towed behind cars on family holidays and parked in driveways and caravan sites all around the coasts of England in the 1950s, called trailers in the USA. It was parked outside Ivy Lodge, the large rambling Edwardian house in Saffron Walden near Cambridge, where I came into this world, opposite the old Victorian red brick country hospital, into which I remembered being carried in my mother's arms a few months later, after the tip of my little finger on my right hand had been squashed in the metal French windows of our house. You can see it I'm holding it up now. See, it's squished. Which is why it's stuck in my memory, no doubt, as my finger had stuck in the door frame. It wasn't our house, but Ivy Lodge was where it all began. Why I wasn't born in the hospital, I don't know. The midwife's, it was the midwife's house, that's right. I can remember now. The old caravan then began a long journey in which everything was permeated intensely with the color green until it arrived in Medina, the city of light, the old medieval Arab city, where it was parked in a dusty street, which is no longer there. I was still inside the caravan when there was this knock on the door. Opening it, I was greeted by 3 luminous men in turbans. Their faces I didn't know, but one said very clearly in English, "Is this the Habibiyya Zawiya?" "Yes," I said, and they then moved past me into the interior of the caravan, where they began to sing beautiful ethereal songs in Arabic that I knew from Morocco. Who were they? I don't know. I awoke whilst still it was dark, entranced by this vivid dream, but in a fever on the floor of an old crumbling Medinan courtyard house. It could have been in another century, except for the fact that family who owned the house were playing blackbirds singing in the dead of night on the roof on an old record player. Eating curried sardines and little else for weeks had taken its toll on me, although there was maybe one other reasons for my sickness. Something in me had collapsed when we arrived in Muzdalifah, a primordial barren valley with high rocky cliffs, where we slept on the sand, where we collected small pebbles to be thrown later at the Devil's Stones in Mina, where we would arrive the following morning. At dawn, while it was still dark, a canoe went off right beside us, causing not a little concern. We were surrounded by over 1 million souls, all assembled with the same expectations. The fever, when it started, was inevitable, like a kind of dying sensation that I recognized and against which I could not resist. I had a fearful sinking sensation, as if my own foundations were collapsing beneath me. Hajj flu, they called it. I really thought this was it. A week or so earlier, I had arrived in the ancient city, which in the Bible is called Becca, now known as Mecca. It was January 1974, and I had entered for the first time a zone of timeless secrets and ancient history, and my life as I had known was going to disappear forever. It was as if all the ghosts of my ancestors had accompanied me and were whispering to me, "Go home, you don't belong here. These aren't your people, just Arabs. They're foreigners, you are better than them, blah, blah, blah." And so the voices went on. It was late in the night, just before dawn, in fact, when I flowed with a large crowd into the floodlit sanctuary, wrapped in the soft, warm desert night. The object of everyone's attention, an enormous, roughly finished cubic granite building, seemed to tower over us, windowless and clad in embroidered black and gold cloth. Suddenly, an amplified voice floated out high above us, reverberating ecstatically into the night air, and my heart stopped in awe. The voices in my head stopped, displaced utterly by this other unearthly sound. It dawned on me that this was indeed my life, and it was all being crystallized into a moment. I couldn't see where the future was, and the past had vanished too. It was both beautiful and bewildering. I was never one to dream much, but my dreams, when I had them, usually had some meaning. My caravan dream was a reminder of where I had arrived, and the journey there from my birth. I wondered how my ancestors viewed their own life after 60 years. Not the ones from long, long ago, but the ones whose lives had directly affected me and who grew up in Victorian and Edwardian times, whose lives I could not conceive of, but from whose loins I had emerged just a few days after the armistice was signed in 1945. So that gives you the kind of pretty, it's kind of...
It's quite sort of, it's interesting because I've been thinking a lot about imagery and how writing in some ways is a bit like painting, that when like a very powerful piece of writing will be like a description of an image or a scene or a picture. And, you know, a good piece of writing doesn't need to explain what it means, and it doesn't, it kind of lets the reader do a bit of work and allows them to sort of reflect on it, and lets it kind of reverberate in the reader. So that, you know, and the thing is that everybody is capable of doing this because we all dream. And so when we dream, we have images which we're left to decipher, and they're not rational sort of sentences that come out which are informative, like this is what this means and this is what you should do. Instead, we have images that just kind of resonate for us in certain ways, and we have to sort of decipher them a little bit. So I'm just going to let Sidra into the room. And it's really interesting how you begin with, I love prologues that do this, when you start with a very powerful image or something that it just has a certain kind of resonance. And in this case, it's an actual dream. And so it's exactly what I'm talking about. It's like it's coming from the subconscious, but this kind of green caravan, the caravan it's a Persian word, right? Is it an Arabic word? I think it's a Persian word. And it's the color green. And it's actually, you know, it's this kind of clash of not a clash, but a collision of a background coming from a small town in, you know, East Anglia or you know, North London, and then being suddenly in Medina. So it's very timely, I think, to be talking about this, because Hajj is just about to begin tomorrow. Yeah, what was your thinking about creating that as a prologue?
I think it was a very powerful dream, and it just sort of, it was kind of my life at the time. I remember that it was so powerful, because it was a difficult journey. Hajj is usually always difficult, but ours was very difficult, and it was a kind of relief. And I had a kind of high fever, and it just explained it. You know, I'd gone from sort of funny little Essex town, nothing, through this journey. But it's kind of, I mean, it was a prophetic dream in many ways, because everything was saturated with green. This is a really important part of it. The caravan, everything in it. And, but it was just saying, well, this is where you came from. This is where you are now. You're in an amazing place.
Yeah, and the caravan is a conveyance as well. It's like an image to just depict the process of life. Like, you start over here and you come from even before. You allude to that and to the sort of the ancestors. It was actually a very clever way of ending that prologue, because you sort of rewind back to the previous generations in Victorian and Edwardian times, and then you end the prologue with your birth, and then it kind of segues quite nicely.
But honestly, nothing's planned about this book at all. It just, you know, when I first started doing it and trying to sort out this blur of my life, I sat down with a laptop. I think basically sketched it out in about 3 weeks, and then expanded it and added to it bits and pieces through the next 15 years. But I know that dream was sort of central to it. And I think dreams are quite important to write down, because you can forget them. I'm not a great dreamer, actually. I think there's 3 dreams I mentioned in this book, which were very powerful. I mean, they're kind of like true dreams, as opposed to just the rubbish which I normally dream about. You know, it's just, and they were so intense. I had to write them down. It wasn't, as I said, it wasn't planned. It just kind of flowed out. And I think the thing about doing a biography is that when you go back and explore what's in there, it's amazing and some people call it the museum of memories, because you go into one room and you discover these things, and then you can see there's a door, and you go into something else you'd completely forgotten about, and you'd be surprised you have incredibly clear memory of these things. When I can remember more clearly when I was 4 than what happened yesterday. It's strange. I'm just, I don't know why, but it was, and that's it. It's in the book, in fact, and it was just an amazing way of just writing about a bit of history that I don't know if people have actually written much about. I mean, have you ever seen Fall's War on television? This describes wartime Hastings and just afterwards. Well, that's what my memory of that time was like. All the cars were black, very few cars, but life was very rich in many ways as well. There was less of it, but it was so intense when I was small, and it was actually very good in many ways, and that's just why I remembered it. But what is a biography? Is just how you slowly, you know, unfold and take in the whole world that you didn't know about. You start with your little tiny world, and it expands as you get older and older. I mean, it's a kind of therapy. You could say it was a kind of, the whole book was a kind of therapy, because I think it uncovered some quite difficult parts. I mean, the thing is, it's not just fun and games. There were some few really difficult parts of my life, and I think writing it exposed these like knots which had to be kind of unraveled in some way to breathe air into it. It didn't necessarily solve the problem, but there was a few critical things that happened which needed like exploring and just easing. And by doing that, it's somehow one could get sort of move on, because there's good things that happen in people's lives and bad things that happen. One can write this all down, but once you've got it written down, somehow you can sort of leave it behind, and that's the effect of writing the book. Because when you got to the point of printing and publishing it, I mean, it's very easy to write a book. It's quite easy to typeset a book. It's easy to design a book. I do it all the time. And book covers are easy. It's easy advertising it. But when you come to actually sell it, print it and distribute it, suddenly you're bearing your soul to the whole world. And I'm quite a private person in some ways. It's hard to find photos of me on the internet. Then suddenly to have this, come to this point where you're going to suddenly send it to a printer, it was like high drama for me. It was a real soul searching. And I was in this sort of fire of deliberation. Do I or don't I? Because there's some quite sensitive things in it which people hadn't written about. If you read the book, you get the picture. But when I hit the send button, it went to the printers. It just all left me. And all the things that happened in my life, I think, which I was really embarrassed about, which I was ashamed of. I wouldn't talk about. I had nothing to do with it. But as I got older and further away from them, they diminished in importance. And when they thought, actually, maybe they were actually quite good. It was quite interesting. But you had to see the good of it and the bad of it to understand it. And as a kind of therapy, I guess writing from that respect is a kind of therapy. It's not just a trade, or I don't do it for make money. I never make it. I don't think I made any money at all with Mike. Who knows? But it's kind of clean. It's a cleanser, and maybe a lot of people write for that reason. I don't know.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I just want to ask, I want to talk more about this topic of tackling tricky topics, because actually we're going to do a salon, our next salon gathering. We're going to focus on this because this is something that's come up not only in memoir but also in fiction. You know, we had a book club about a book called River Spirit, and it's set in during the Mahdist uprising in Sudan, and she talks about war and violence and some really very heavy topics, but also, you know, portraying Muslims doing things that are, you know, many of us would look at and go, well, that's wrong, right? And so this in itself is a very challenging thing to do, especially if you've been, you know, if it's been inculcated into the idea that you should never, you know, make any kind of accusation or condemnation over another Muslim and cover up their sins and hide, you know, make excuses for them and things like this. But I think more and more, this is a narrative that is being challenged among Muslims, particularly in terms of, well, just very simply, oh, hold on, let me just admit, Patrick. By the way, everybody, please do put your questions into the chat. I'm on my phone, so it's a bit awkward for me to see them, but please do, and we'll have a little Q&A at the end. So I would like to just hear your thoughts a little bit about this, because you do delve into some territory which is very difficult. It's not just difficult personally to experience it and to, you know, to know about these things, but to actually write about, and you name it as spiritual abuse in the book, which I think was a very brave thing to do, because it's something that I felt, I mean, from my knowledge of this, you know, growing up in the same household, it felt like a real kind of cloud, like a heavy cloud hanging over us in a sense.
I think there was a kind of omerta, if you know what the omerta is. There were sort of unspoken things. I grew up in a family, in fact, my own father had a deep problem with his own father, who, you need to read the book, there's a picture of my grandfather, he's on the front here. That's my grandfather there. He was a real character, and he changed his name. He had 4 children, who my 2 uncles and aunts and my father. And then he left, he divorced my grandmother and left and created a new identity. He changed his name, started another family, and probably a few other families as well. But I think the effect on my father was really terrible, I think. And although he was alive, when I was alive, we never met him. We've never spoken about it. He was spoken about as the old man. But they were kind of, he was kind of, I sense, traumatized a bit by it. And I didn't even know it. See, we have things which we're kind of also slightly traumatized about, but which we've worked through, and it's part of history. As far as criticizing people, yeah, it's something that's come up about, there is, I mean, people talk about riba, which is backbiting, which is quite wrong. We don't gossip about other people. But I think if there's some things which are really serious that people need to be warning about, then you're actually bound to talk about it. It's called halal riba. I'm typesetting a book about it once. But it has to be done very judiciously and very carefully, and it's a difficult thing to do, and one has to be very, very careful. But I've covered some of this area in the book, and the only way I could do it was to not form a judgment. And I know this from as far as the libel laws go. I consulted a barrister about this, and he said, well, you can describe everything that happens, but you can't at the end of it say, well, therefore he is a or she is a. Then you could be libeling them. But the book, as I tried to make it like a video, like a video camera, just describing what happens as dispassionately as possible, and only occasionally making, well, actually, that wasn't, you know, I did have an opinion about that. And that actually sort of leaves it in the hands of the person who's reading it. But I think you have to then be honest and say, well, this was good, and this was bad. And you have to be, and then the truth is just amazingly, it defends you at the end, because you could give it to someone and say, well, you might disagree, but it's true, isn't it? And they would have to say, well, yeah, it's true, that happened. And obviously we get false memories about things, but on the whole, you tend to sift through it. So how did you feel when you were 20 years old? You know, how did you really think when you were 25 years old? Did you really? we change in many ways in our opinions about and the way we think about things. Like, it made me think deeply about what I was like 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But that's in the book. You'll read
yeah,
it.
that's the beauty of writing memoirs, that you can go back and not just write about a narrative of what you remember happening, but also reflect on who were you at that time, how much have you changed, and then it gives I think that gives another dimension to the writing, of depth to the writing, which is examining your own lens, right, and understanding your own perspective and how that's changing, and it's not a fixed thing.
You have to see your own shortcomings. It's absolutely true.
Okay, there's loads of other things I'd love to ask you about. Please do, everybody, put your questions in the chat. I will do my best to, let me just check and see if oh, there is something in the chat. Sidra said something. Yes, she did. She said that was a beautiful way to put it, but that was some time ago. I'm sorry, I didn't catch it. I wanted to just go back to the musical side of it for a moment, for those of you who joined us a bit later. So Abdal Latif, who is also my dad, hello, was a professional musician in London in the 1960s and performed at both of the Isle of Wight festivals, for example, same stage as Jimi Hendrix, Mamas and the Papas, lots and lots of those big things. Who, sorry?
I said Bob Dylan.
Bob Dylan, yes.
The Doors, Miles Davis, Tony.
You have to read the book to get all of those juicy little name drops. But what I wanted to think about a little bit is the sort of musicality of writing, and how, especially with jazz, and I think also with the sort of prog rock or psychedelic rock, I'm not sure how you would have described Mighty Baby, and especially with the Habibiyya as well, there was a lot of improvisation, right? And so I think, oh yeah, she says that was about having the knots untied, yes. So in the specifically, I think very much in those particular genres of music, there's a lot of improvisation, and that's something that has always really drawn me as well to jazz, for example, and vocal improvisation. And I don't improvise on instruments, but vocal improvisation for sure. And there's something so liberating about just the thing of like, I don't know where I'm going with this, I'm just going to give this a try. And there's a lot of fun and playfulness in that as well. And would you say that's kind of, I get the sense that that's overflowed into your writing also?
Well, yeah, I mean, Miles Davis said there's no such thing as a mistake. You can take that as you want, but it means that as you're playing music, every time you do something unusual, it opens a new door to something else. And if you listen to Miles Davis play, you think he's making real odd mistakes, but he's not. It's all fits into a kind of pattern. And I think that the creative process is, a lot of this is about just going where you didn't expect you would go and then seeing what happens. But it's still also a kind of language. Certainly, if I was really a pianist, I was a keyboard player, and your hands actually direct you. Your hands remember everything. It's amazing. It's not in here, it's all in here. And the hands would do certain things, and they would go, blah, 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 you don't know what's going to happen. It's different from like actually writing a song or a tune or something, which is more of a kind of a calculation to have a calculated effect. But it's just, I mean, it's a huge subject, actually. I get lost into it.
Well, I think the point there is that there's a flow that you can tap into, and whether with writing, if you're writing a stream of consciousness, or maybe you just get on a roll with a poem and you can just flow with it. But then with writing, you would go back and edit it, not necessarily, but you can. You have that option.
I think I just realised something else now, which is about the fact that people have been forced into a kind of a situation now where you have to be a brilliant or perfect singer to sing, or a perfect instrumentalist to do it at all. Most people don't do it. They don't venture into the realm of music because they've become a couch potato, like I'm sitting on a sofa here. And most of the world now become consumers of music or writing, whatever. They don't actually do it themselves. Where in the past, everyone did it themselves. I mean, I heard a short story about when I was in California. I was asked to give a talk about Islam and music in it's called a community college just inside from the south coast, Livermore it was called. And Hamza Yusuf had done the lecture before, so I better do this, you know. And I went along with some friends. I told them about playing in the music business and how we were looking for a kind of music, which when I heard this music from Morocco, I fell in love with it, and I started to do it. And the class was about 50, aged between 18 and 30. Someone said, "Can we hear some of this singing from Morocco?" I thought, oh dear. So
put you on the spot.
We sang something. It was like, but then they applauded at the end of it. This is a class. And the girl said, "Could you now translate it, please?" And my friend Shaka, he translated it in as best he could. And they applauded that as well. And they stayed for about an hour asking questions. Normally they were just checking for 10 minutes to get the credits and leave. And one of so I thought, who are these kids? This was actually 7 years ago, so it hasn't really changed much. I said to them, "Does anyone know what an audio cassette is?" And no one put their hands up. "Does anyone know what an MP3 is?" And yes, people put their hands up. And then I said, "Does anyone here play a musical instrument?" And one person put his hand up. And I said, "What's the instrument you play?" And he said, "A bagpipes." I thought, this is a generation that consumes, they don't do. And if you went to a typical room a living room in, say, England or anywhere probably in the Western world in the 1940s or 50s, there was always a piano in the room. And we're probably going back to Victorian times when pianos became fashionable. If you went to the same room now, there's just a giant TV screen. People stopped recreating music. It's called recreation, called you recreate. We grew up playing music, singing, and people stop doing it because they're afraid of making mistakes. They don't want to, everything has to be sort of perfect. No, the whole point of singing in a choir is it takes all these different voices singing, maybe even slightly out of tune, to the greatest effect. But it's been sort of denied, unless you're into sort of singing and you join a choir, but it was so much part of people's life. You go to Morocco, maybe it's changing in Morocco, but everybody sings in Morocco from they're very, very young. They grow up with their parents singing, and they learn all these things like the Burba and the Hamziya and obviously Quran as well. It's very vocal, and everyone does it. No one's worried about if you're singing out of tune. And largely speaking, people don't sing out of tune. I don't
because they've got practice.
I guess, but you know, the thing about singing is that there was a voice coach told me once that she could take someone who's tone deaf to sing in pitch perfect. And it's not psychological, it's not mental. What they do is they strengthen the lungs and the heart by doing exercises like, get it? And what it does, it brings about kind of harmony in the body. And then whatever you do is going to be in harmony, whether it's singing or whether it's writing, whatever. But it's just to make the body kind of harmonize the body. But it's just that this thing about making, you know, we've become this, there's no margin of error now in modern culture. You know, I think I'm going to write a book called The Margin of Error. Everything's pixel perfect now, unless it's, you know, it's like when you get old people like me trying to buy a ticket on the internet. You know, unless you've got every single tiny digit absolutely perfect, you don't get the ticket. The old days, you would go to a travel agent and you could sit there, oh, yeah, well, it's roughly there, roughly this, roughly that. I could go on about this forever, actually. But it's very important thing that's stopping people doing things. It's stopping people singing. It's stopping people drawing, writing, because they're afraid they're going to be disapproved of. It doesn't matter. You start off doing calligraphy badly, but then it gets better. There's a whole poem about that written by some Persian calligrapher from the 14th century. It says, you start off, don't worry, it makes it terrible, but the more you do it, the better it gets, and finally it becomes beautiful. And that's what people should do, but they're stymied now. They can't do it because, okay, I've talked enough.
No, but it's very good because you're very passionate about it, and I'm also very passionate about this as well, because I think, I mean, obviously I've received all this education from you all my life, but I think it is absolutely the truth, and I think it's a fear of that vulnerability of being exposed as being imperfect. And really, it's like, actually, why would you read a story about somebody who's perfect? It's boring. If you want to read a story, you pick up a novel or a story, or you go watch a movie. It's about people making mistakes. But it's like, because you can see other people learning from their mistakes, you can learn from them as well, but it's fiction. But when you do it yourself and you put yourself out there and you make a mistake, then suddenly it's the end of the world. And I think that is a terrible tragedy, actually.
But obviously, if you look at a painting of Van Gogh, you get up close, it's all very messy. And you look at some old buildings, they're all, I mean, look at the Alhambra, or you go to the Acropolis in Athens. They were originally covered with color and paint and gold, but now it's all just like crumbling and stuff, but it's very beautiful. The tolerances used to be quite broad, you know, that when an architect drew a pencil on a piece of paper, it corresponded to about a figure's width in real life. Now it's like they design things at 7 decimal places. I mean, they build buildings, you know, to the tolerances of building an aircraft. It's stupid. I mean, it's just madness, really. It's pixel perfect ISIS.
But I think ironically, it is to do with tolerance, and it's kind of like a lack of tolerance, isn't it? Because that error of margin needs to be there in order to have the flexibility to get creative.
The thing is the margin of error. There's got to be a bigger margin of error, because then it's more forgiving. I think it makes people frustrated, and it makes people intolerant of other people's faults. You know, everyone's got to be perfect. It's fascist. You know,
I think we could even develop a sort of a theory here about the rahma of art and like creativity, like that kind of tolerance and that forgiveness. Actually, that was spot on. It's about forgiveness, and having a margin of error is more forgiving, and therefore it's merciful. Like if we're expected to have or taught to have mercy and everything, then we should be having that kind of mercy on ourselves and being able to say, you know what, the first draft of my poem or my story or my novel or my song is not going to be great, and actually that's exactly as it should be, and therefore that's not going to stop me from trying.
Yeah, well, I know that you know, people go to see music. I remember going to see Brenda Russell in London, and I loved the record she did, and the show was exactly like the CD. It was very, very good, but the very few, only you have to be kind of professional musicians from LA to do that. We would go on stage, and you never knew what was going to happen. You know, you'd often get someone in the back of the stage going, "Rubbish, bloody rubbish, get off." Or else if they started to nod on the front rows, it was like you started to communicate, because it was all about you played the audience rather than the other way around. You weren't just an act. You know, people go on a stage and they just do an act and they don't care the audience. But it was always nice to know the audience and to play to the audience. Well, you know about it. You're a performer.
But that's also very interesting, because I'm thinking a lot lately about performing and writing, because writing, in some ways, it's similar to performing, because you are like broadcasting yourself to people, but it doesn't have that immediacy. Like you say, if you're performing live to an audience, you are reading the room, you're gauging it, and you're getting something back from them. And it's famously, if you're a musician playing to a bad crowd, it just completely zaps your energy, and it's really hard to play to a bad crowd. And just said she's inspired to pick up her paints. Very good. We love I love the sort of cross-pollination of all of these different arts. What was I going to say though? Well, I wanted to just bring it back to the writing process very quickly, because I don't want to drag on and on. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. So in terms of actually channeling all of these thoughts and all this creative process into a finished article, which is this book for everybody who's joined us late. What was your process? You mentioned that having the dancing book show, you mentioned that having a deadline was very helpful for you, and that being able to say, create in all creative arts, and I found this as well, and many creatives will say the same thing, like having a deadline is very productive, because it'll force you to go, okay, I need to get off my seat now. What got you through those stages of not just the production of it, but the editing of it, and the sort of winding it all up and closing it off and sort of signing it off in a way?
Well, the truth is, it was such a kind of like fraught process coming up to the point of printing that I must admit, you'll find a few typos here and there and a bit of syntactical nonsense. But it proves that at least it wasn't written by artificial intelligence, unless AI has actually figured out how to make typos. It also, I mean, if it sells out, we'll do another version with it, which will be kind of, we've gone through it thoroughly now. Every time I see a typo, it's like becoming sort of red hot poker stuck in my leg. It's like, ah, but it's the way it happened. Partly because I think I was writing the way I speak. Whereas if you write carefully, you see all the hyphenated words. You don't miss certain. You just don't miss things if you're really, really careful. And why you have to have copy editors? Why you have to have proofreaders? And if you go through a proper publisher, which is, I couldn't find anyone interested in publishing. It's such a weird book in some ways. It doesn't fit into any genre. Well, it's apart from it being a bio, but it's you feel the books of heavy Islamic doctrine, theology and stuff. I wouldn't see the city on the same shelf somehow. I think it was written, very importantly, it was written for the people I kind of left behind. It's a thing that came out it was one of the knots I discovered, was that I went through, and I talk about it in the book. I went from Quaker idyllic upbringing to architecture in London by myself, hard drinking, hard edged architects. And they didn't mix. The Quakers and the architects was two different worlds. I wouldn't have taken them at all. My parents wouldn't have understood it, wouldn't have liked it. Then I went from the architects to the world of showbiz almost overnight. I promise you, I went from overnight, because you read about it in the book. I was suddenly on radio shows. I was traveling around England. I was having photographs taken. I had managers recording to George Martin suddenly appeared on the scene. It was intoxicating, but the architects wouldn't have understood the musicians. Do you see? I was going through these worlds, not connecting them. Then I went from the musicians into the world of the inner universe of Islam. A lot of the musicians didn't really make that transition. So at the end of the day, was actually not very good. I would love to have had I've met people. I remember Richard Thompson. I went to a launch of one of his records, and his mother and sister were there. And I thought, that's amazing. He's got his mother and sister. He's geek. I couldn't believe it. And it's kind of with embarrassment in a way, but it's just the way things happen. And it's kind of looking at it sort of unlocked it. And in a way, the book is written for all those people I left behind. You understand? It sounds a bit strange, that, but it's actually actually had an enormous impact on my life. I was on a bus going from up Parade Street from Paddington to where I lived in Notting Hill, and I just sort of suddenly burst into tears. And I just didn't understand why. And I sort of suddenly I suddenly realized, I was all kind of rebelling against my parents without even realizing it. And people rebel against their parents in different ways. It's not just going to go out and go bonkers and tattoo myself ever and whatever. It can happen in much more sophisticated ways, in being sort of secretive, and it's all psychological.
It's really interesting. Well, does anybody else have any questions? I'd like to open it up to the floor. You can unmute or put your hand up if you want. It is a very interesting story. It is a quirky story, I've got to say, in the sense that, like you say, it doesn't really fit in any particular genre. Although I think my feeling is, I mean, you and Mum also have been working in the field of Islamic books for what, 40 years or something like that. Like you in the design area, but my mum was a bookseller for many years, and so you guys have you can take a very good pulse on it. But I personally feel that there has been a big lack, a major dearth of very personal stories, not just the typical kind of conversion story, because we don't necessarily, I mean, it's very heartening and it's very inspiring. And Sidi Haroon, he's written a very interesting book about, heart's turn of, people who've sort of come back to faith after some other sort of experience. But to have that realness and to have people being honest about their experiences and actually saying this was really difficult as well, it is very useful for the reader. It's not just this kind of lovely, hunky-dunky story. I mean, hunky-dunky is not a word, hunky-dory story. It reveals the challenges that human beings have to go through. And that's the reason why we read. We don't read, like I said before, we don't read a story or watch a movie where everything goes right. We want to see our protagonists being challenged and put through their paces, because we want to see how they come out of it. Because on some level, we can actually learn from that. Even if they make a mistake in the choices that they make, eventually you see how it pans out and you can go, right, I might do the same thing, I might not. But it's a way of vicariously having those experiences. And I don't know, I just wanted to hear your thoughts a little bit about where you think that could go.
I'm very conscious that, and I said this isn't really a conversion story, because I was so tired of reading these talks. I did this terrible life and I read the Quran and suddenly I was happy. no, it wasn't like that at all. You know, I was living a very creative life, and these things happened to me, and I was dragged into this whole thing. As I expect, the books fell on my head. You know, I didn't understand it, and I hard to express this actually, but kind of lost the thread a bit there. But it's kind of
that's my fault. I gave a very vague question.
What I was going to say is that I've for 30 years now, I've worked with these scholars doing their all very academic books, not all academics, but a lot of it. And I've sort of understood some of it, but anyway, I wanted to try and relate some of these things that I knew, I understood, to like a more kind of human and normal level. Not just, you didn't have to be a scholar to understand these things, because there's incredible riches in these books, but sometimes the people doing the translations, and the translator is the key person, because he's taking something which from a world you don't know and don't understand, and putting it in a language you can understand. And things get lost in translation, and that's the trouble. And I think there's become a sort of like, well, they're up there and we're down here. It's not like that. It's actually really useful and beautiful. I wouldn't say that's in my book, but it doesn't discount the fact that there is incredible knowledge that is Islam, the inner universe of Islam is something which it's not really been explored by people in the West. They're so stuck with, you know, the outward
the political side of it,
or the political side, whatever. But it's just that they're so afraid to go inside, you know. And we don't come from a culture that, I don't know. I felt a need to sort of make it a bit more realistic. I mean, as I said, that Islam for me was very difficult to start with. You know, I was very drawn to this beautiful singing from North Africa. You know, it was like, imagine the Gregorian chant sung to flamenco. This was like, God, I thought, I have to have this music, whatever, even if I had to stand on my head and tar myself with feathers. And the truth is, actually, for a couple of years, it was extremely hard. I was like being grilled and boiled like a lentil of some sort. But and often I've heard said that it's better that it starts off difficult and it gets easier than starting off easy and it gets difficult, because things do get better. But you go through this when you first change your life and you start praying and washing and all this stuff. It's so odd, and it takes so long for it to become normal. And you're this sort of zealot to start with, and everyone becomes, there's nothing worse than the convert zealot. I promise there's nothing worse. They'll kind of hate each other, actually. I mean, and the kind of people I was studying with weren't the kind of people I would normally be friends with, in fact. I was suddenly involved with people. And actually, the beautiful thing about Islam, which people rarely say who come from out this other culture, is that suddenly you meet hundreds and hundreds of people you would never have met, you know, if you hadn't. And I can say now, hand on heart, that I have hundreds and hundreds of really dear friends all over the world. I know people who haven't made this step, who maybe know about 4 or 5 really close friends. I've got people, you know, I would go to who are, you know, my brothers or sisters who I've known for 50 years. And I have to reflect on that sometimes. I think, well, it's quite extraordinary, because you never feel lonely. There's always there. And if they're not coming in your door, they're phoning you, or you're writing to them, or they're giving you some work to do. It's an amazing door to something, which I think that the unliberated soul doesn't have that kind of world. I don't know. Maybe it's not true. Maybe I've got millions of friends. I'm trying to say something here. I'm not very clearly. I should write it down.
Yeah, it's a good thing to write about. I think that's a really beautiful expression, actually, of something that I noticed as well about Islam. It is, and the translation analogy is key there, because if you are a translator, you have to be a native of the language you're translating into, and in a way that
you have to get it right too, because you could mistranslate and mislead people.
Yeah,
and that often happens, you know. And also, it's sort of not translated in acceptable language. It's too highfalutin, or it's all Arabic words which you don't understand. I mean, when we did the D1, I insisted it's going to have transliteration, so people who didn't know Arabic could sing it. And other people, it's all in Arabic, assuming you're going to read Arabic. Well, most people can't read Arabic, but they want to sing it, they want to recite it, whatever. I mean, it's good to learn Arabic, I agree.
I think in a way that's an interesting point to come back to the book, because that, in a sense, I feel is your voice. Your voice is very accessible, and because it is very colloquial, it doesn't feel forced in any way. If anything, it's been edited to make it more formal, or, you know, sort of less colloquial, but it's very much, it's almost like little thoughts that pop in your mind and you just sort of put them down there, because it's a bit like improvising music. You just kind of go with what's coming, and then there's an editorial process afterwards, which, you know, for some people is less and some people is more, but it kind of always has to be there, and it's part of the pain of writing, actually. But it's also so brilliant to be able to edit your output, because, yeah, like you say, you know, once you say something, it's very hard to, you can't take it back again afterwards.
Rewind, yeah. It's
Well, anyway, I think if we don't have any questions, I will call time, or bring this ship to land, whatever the bring this ship to land. What a mixed metaphor. Yes, no, it's ship to land, as in off the shore. I was thinking of an aeroplane. But yes, thank you so much, Abdal Latif, aka Dad, for talking to us about your creative life. Mashallah, it is a really extraordinary life, and we'll put the link to buy the book in the caption, in the description, and this will be available to watch on our membership platform. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
We're doing a presentation of this next weekend in Bradford, actually. If anyone who wants to go to Bradford, £7 the tickets, I think. Myself and with Richard Thompson, who can fill the. So he can fill the Albert Hall. I couldn't fill the broom cupboard, but he very, very nicely, because I've known him for a very long time, very nicely agreed to appear on stage presenting this book, which he actually encouraged me to print in the first place. So I'm blaming that.
Interesting. Sidra, he actually read a little clip at the beginning, so I'm going to save this to the platform, and you can go back and watch, read at the beginning. He read several pieces actually from the book, which is really nice. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Take care. Okay. Have a really lovely Sunday evening.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.